Hi everyone and welcome back to my At Silk. Today I'm going to be giving you guys some tips for colouring with Copic markers on toned tan paper. Colouring on tan paper is a great way to get a vintagey look and feel to your colouring, and it's also a unique and different way to use your markers, and it may not be something that you've done before. So this is the paper I'm going to be using today. It's called Toned Tan and it's manufactured by Strathmore. It comes in sketchbooks of various sizes. I have the larger and the smaller ones. The paper is very smooth, but it still retains a textured appearance. So the paper fibres are easily visible on the surface of the paper, even though the paper is very smooth. The paper is also quite thin. It's 118 grams or 80 pounds, and it feeds very easily through your printer, so it can work well with printable colouring pages and things like that. Even though it is thin, the paper works well with pencils, particularly Prismacolors, and they also work with alcohol-based markers. However, because the paper is thin and smooth, there is going to be a limit to the number of layers that you can apply. So for this tips video, I'm going to be colouring this illustration. It's called Garden, and it comes from my Spring Garden colouring set. If any of you want to follow along and colour the same image, or you want to check out the colouring set, then there's an Etsy link in the description box below. Anyway, I ripped a page out of my 9x12 sketchbook and I trimmed it down to an A4 size, just so that it can go through my European printer. And I printed the colouring page out in the grey line art option because I didn't want the black to be too strong, as the whole colouring page will eventually have quite a soft colouring, a soft look, so I didn't want dark black lines. The first and probably most important tip I found when it comes to working with alcohol-based markers, Copics, Pro markers, brush markers, whatever you have, on toned tan paper, is that you must test the colours out first, and even more importantly, you need to leave them to dry. And this is something you probably won't be used to doing if you work with markers. On the whole, marker ink dries pretty instantaneously and the colours don't change, but it's completely different when you're working with this paper. The ink will go on much darker and then it will change colour as it dries. Now with Copic markers, depending on the paper, that can happen a little bit anyway, but it happens a lot more on this paper than you've probably seen before, and it definitely happened the most on this paper than I've ever seen before, and I've worked on several different types of marker papers. So as you can see, I'm doing these test swatches, and the ink goes on very dark, and then after about 5 minutes it lightens. And another thing to bear in mind is that because of the tan background colour, the Copic colours will not look the same as they do on white paper. This is probably a very obvious point, but still it is something that you need to take into account, and do test colours before you use them. Most of the colours will be quite similar, but some of them, particularly I found the blue tones, were quite different and much darker even when they were dry. So you definitely need to do several tests, and I used my colour chart and then made another colour chart on the toned tan paper to sort of compare the colours, and I did leave the markers to dry for at least 5 minutes before the colour had settled. I think this is by far the most important thing to bear in mind when working on tan paper, and probably the biggest difference you'll find to working on white paper. So I started first with the pink flowers, laying down the lightest pink, putting some middle pink for a little bit of shadow, then a darker pink, and then layering the lighter colours back over the darker ones in order to blend them out. And I find that when approaching this sort of illustration, it can be very hard to decide where to put the colours, and it's important to me to get the colour balance right. So I find that if I can just place one colour right away, it doesn't matter what colour it is or which part of the drawing I'm colouring, as long as I have that one colour down, I can then quite easily go and place all the rest of the other colours around it in order to balance the colour out. So for this illustration I chose a limited colour palette as usual, and I went for spring flowery colours, yellow, pink, green and a blue, and then I also used a putty colour in the background just so it would keep the vintagey feel. So one of the unique characteristics of colouring on tan paper is that the tan colour creates an underlayer or an underpainting effect for your colouring. sometimes in watercolour, for instance, or digital art, an artist may wash a watercolour painting piece with one colour before putting on any blue or greens or anything. So they may put a whole wash of yellow, even under the sky area, and that kind of gives everything a warm undertone. And then in digital art, sometimes people will place a texture in the background, or they'll place layers on top of layers and put the opacity down so that the background layers come through the foreground layers a bit, or put a layer on top of everything. And I find that when you're working on tan paper, you get a similar effect. And the tan paper and the texture of the paper, the not the texture but the fibers that you can see on the paper surface, they all show through the marker ink. So all the markers, all the colours that you put down, no matter what colours you're putting, light or dark, muted or vivid, they will all pick up some of the tan background colour, and it creates a really unified look, and so the whole piece takes on a very warm undertone. I think this gives the colouring a really vintage old photograph look, and it's a really interesting technique if you want to get a sort of a unified tone to your whole piece, and particularly if you want to have a bit more texture, because as I said, the fibres of the paper, you can see them quite clearly through the marker ink, and it just gives the whole piece a very different look, particularly for marker colouring. Another thing to bear in mind is that the marker colours will become more muted when they're placed on the tone tan paper, but I was really impressed with how some of the lighter shades, particularly the yellow and the light pink, showed up, because the pink, I think it was RV02 I was using, it was lighter in tone than the tan paper, but still it was showing up on it really well, and I was just really pleased with how that all worked out. Even for skin tones, some of my lightest skin tones that I did some tests with, they stood out as well. So you don't have to use dark colours on tan paper, you can use light colours. They will not obviously stand out as much as they would on white paper, but you do get some very interesting effects with them. And as you can see, as I'm colouring here and during the course of this time lapse, the colours are going on dark, and that's perfectly normal, as I was explaining earlier, and all you need to do is wait and they lighten up, and it is a little bit magical actually watching it as you're colouring. I had to personally slightly adjust my expectations and mindset, because I'm so used to placing down colours with markers and pretty instantly seeing the shade and just having the colour as is. But with this, I had to kind of let the colours come, and the whole process was really fun, and I really did enjoy watching the piece change as I was working on it. As for some tips for layering the markers in the bleed through, because the paper is thin, the marker ink does bleed through. This is a common problem with using markers in most sketchbooks, but with this paper it bleeds through almost at once. So even as you layer down that very first layer of Copic colour, you'll find that it's coming through to the next page of the sketchbook. So you'll want to keep in mind, or at least to remember, to place a scrap piece of paper or a piece of cardstock under your page to protect the rest of your sketchbook, or even to protect the surface of your desk, because I was finding that the marker ink was actually getting onto the white surface of my desk. I didn't end up doing a whole heap of layering. I think the most I did was on the pink flowers, and I went over them 6 or 7 times, I think, in the end, putting on the base tones, building up the shadow, and then going back over them again in order with the lighter shades to blend them all together. And I did that, I think in total that was 6 or 7 layers of marker ink. I found that the ink stayed within the lines quite well. There was a tiny bit of feathering or bleeding, that's where the marker ink spreads further than where you placed it, but it was very minimal and it didn't cause me any problems. But I think if you're planning to do many layers, then you might want to test or just sort of take the feathering into account, because obviously the more ink you saturate the paper with, the further it will spread. I did find that if you leave the ink to dry in between layers, that does help stop the feathering, so that's another sort of tip to keep in mind if you're planning to do a lot of layers. Another tip is to use white as a colour in your piece. As the paper is not white, you can use white really effectively here, and it stands out and pops against the tan colour of the background. So it can be really useful in drawing the viewer's eye to different sections of your drawing or highlighting different aspects. And of course, if you outline your finished piece in a white, or draw a white line or do some white sort of shading around the outside of your piece, it can make your image look like a sticker and it can really pop out in your sketchbook. I would recommend using white pencils. This is a personal preference. I did some tests and I found that the pencils stood out much better on the paper than the jelly rolls or the white paint pens. I used a polychromos white in this piece, but a Prismacolor or whatever you have would work great. Also, the white pencils work really well on top of the marker ink as well, so I was able to add highlights in multiple areas, and because the tan paper makes the entire colour palette subdued, so any vivid or really vibrant colours are of course toned down by the paper colour, then adding the white back in can kind of bring back some vibrance to the piece. I found it made quite a difference to my illustration, but of course it's entirely up to you. And colouring normally, white may not be a colour that you think about using often, but when working on tan paper, it's something that you can really effectively take advantage of. So here's the finished piece. I really liked the look, and I liked how all the colours came out and how they all tied together and how it had the vintage feel. And I think the whole look is very different to what I would normally achieve with marker colouring. And I even think the back looks pretty cool too. It kind of has a watercolour-y look. Anyway, so I hope you found this video helpful. I did a little bit of research on YouTube before I made this tutorial, and I didn't find any tutorials specifically for marker colouring on tone tan paper. And so I wanted to share with you some of the tips that I know and some of the things that I have come across when working with markers on tone tan paper, and I hope that you'll give this colouring technique a go. It's a bit more unusual, but it's definitely something that's a fun and something that's just different, and it's a different effect that you can get with your markers. And obviously this paper is normally used in the art sort of community, particularly on YouTube. It's normally used with coloured pencils, and if you're interested in using this paper with coloured pencils, then there are some good tutorials on that if you type that into the YouTube search bar. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a wonderful week everyone, and I will see you next time.